Datasphere Initiative is a non-for-profit foundation, and we can say that we are incorporated in Switzerland, so that's wonderful. It happens recently, even if we've been working for a year and a half almost, that builds agile frameworks to responsibly unlock the value of data for all, right? And each of those words is a very important word in itself. With the help of our global network of individuals and organizations working on expanding, we work on expanding the top of data governance, understand it better, understand the sectors that have formed it. And we aim to promote new approaches to data policymaking through the vision of a collaborative governed data sphere. The data sphere can be defined as the complex system encompassing all types of data, their dynamic interactions with human groups and norms, right? How we govern the data sphere will really determine how, what is the future we want to live in the 21st century. So Sophie is sharing some links in our chat about some of the with the papers we have been working on, defining the data sphere and other relevant papers. So keep an eye on it. Well, many of you today have joined us from different disciplines and sectors, mostly academia, but also the private sector, civil society, and governance representatives are here today. So thank you again for being here with us. You might be working on data governance projects yourself. You may be curious to learn more about the Datasphere Initiative, but whatever is your purpose to be here, we are pleased and that you're here and encourage you to comment and give feedback on the events today. The fellows are here to present, right? Our 8 fellows are here to present from 8 different countries as our first cohort, and I'm sure they will really welcome your comments. Some of the documents were shared with those who have registered, as for example, the draft of the literature review that Tim is going to present in a second. So please do share your feedback in chat, via email. We are really looking forward to having you participate in this knowledge building exercise. Well, as a key part of the fellows' work was to explore the concept of the data sphere and how it can be useful for designing best practices and frameworks for data governance in a holistic manner, right? So it really unlocks the value for all. So it's just not thinking about micro issues, but also the whole picture. The fellows have produced blog posts, videos, presentations, participated in various events, produced academic papers, even chapters of books, including a large literature review of the term data governance. These are just some outputs of this cohort, and we're very thankful for them to put so much energy and time on producing this and sharing their journey with us. Each fellow took a different but complementary approach to help us hone the concept of the data sphere and considered data policy through different lenses on the issue, ranging from data quality, the metaverse, health data, the new norms coming out of Europe within the data strategy, platform transparency, and open data. They discussed issues around sharing data and lots of other issues from interoperability and so forth and so on. This event provides just a moment for the fellows to share their thinking into the concept of the data sphere and the timely research they have conducted, which show interesting insights on how we as a community can work together to responsibly unlock the value of data for all. So kickstarting the first session, it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Daves, who is our senior fellow and director of research for Connected by Data, a wonderful nonprofit, and Bertrand de la Chapelle, who is our chief vision officer at the Datasphere Initiative, besides being one of my co-founders here. So Tim and Bertrand, please, I pass the word to you.
Great. Bertrand, do you want to kick off or shall I launch in? So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and share my screen. It is a pleasure to be here with current new fellows and others who've been supporting this kind of journey of the Datasphere Initiative. I'm going to just share my screen and have a few slides to just take us through the literature review we've been working on. It's been a really interesting project to pursue. I think when we started out, we didn't quite realize the scale and rapid growth of work on data governance. We were seeking to understand what ground we might be standing on, what's come before, and what the landscape looked like. And in the 9 or so months we've been doing that, it's been moving fast under our feet, this kind of landscape. So what I'm giving you here is a snapshot. I think the draft report's been shared with you, so the slides are just some images pulled out from that report, but you've got the detail in the report itself. So I'm just going to try and spend 10 minutes giving you a quick overview of observing and defining the data governance debates, a bit of the methodology we used in putting together this bibliometric-driven literature review, some of the landscape we see, and then look at the Datasphere framework. So the starting point for all of this is to recognize that data governance is a growing field that's bringing together a number of formerly quite distinct areas of focus. So just over a decade ago, the academic literature was hardly talking about data governance. Today, we've got hundreds of papers being published a year using that as the core concept they're structured around. The same has broadly been true in the popular literature. Again, the term data governance really not registering until maybe 2005 and beyond. And it has seen growth. But as this chart from Google's Ngrams Explorer, which shows mentions in about 3% of published English language books, the kind of percentage of books in which the term appears, we see data governance is growing, but it's still a niche concept compared to some of the other things that, as we'll see, kind of conceptually fall within it. So you're still much more likely to encounter discussions of data protection or data management or particular data governance approaches like open data than you are to encounter a data governance discussion, even though data governance as a framework is starting to bring some of those things together. And that brings us to a contemporary working definition of data governance, where we can see that it can be a space that integrates those formerly distinct agendas: data protection, data management, data sharing. And in the paper, we review a number of past literature reviews and find that while early work centered on data governance primarily in terms of data and information management, there's increasingly been work that addresses data governance as a broader public issue, requiring emphasis on inter-organizational data sharing, opening data, data ethics, data justice, the social impacts of how we handle data. And I recall in my own past work on open data, often being faced with situations where open data and privacy and data protection was set up as oppositional concepts, that there was a kind of divide between those. Whereas within a modern data governance paradigm, these are all strategies for managing data, and the challenge is about finding the right strategy for the right data that delivers the greatest public value while respecting fundamental rights and claims. As the slide says, it's about foregrounding both benefits and harms of data, having a much more mature conversation about what it is to govern this resource. However, that integrative definition of data governance does not mean that all the literature we look at is necessarily well integrated. In fact, as we looked at the literature, we found quite a fragmented field. And before I go on to pull out some of the findings there, it's worth just mentioning the methods we used, which was to combine selected in-depth reading of a number of papers with bibliometric models that treat the published literature on data governance in essence as a data set, to recognize with hundreds and hundreds of papers, there's no way we can manually read through, digest, synthesize every one of the insights at the level that might be needed, but that we can treat this as a data set and look at a number of different signals as part of exploratory work to generate some leads and insights, and more often raise questions that help us dig further into what's published. So we look at a range of signals from simple publication counts like the ones you've just seen, to publication metadata like the thematic classification of the journals that papers are published in, used as a proxy for the disciplines writing about data. We use some author analysis, looking at the location of authors' institutions to get a sense of where in the world scientific production around data governance is taking place and how collaborative that is across geographic or institutional boundaries. We look at citation analysis to see who's writing papers together or who's citing who, and look at what the networks, that builds of how close to each other different areas of the literature are different pockets of literature feeding off and connected to others. And then we use some keyword networks to look at the co-occurrence of particular terms and keywords in abstracts and full text of publications, again, to see what terms are being discussed together, what's close, what's distant, as we network that, not those descriptions give us a chance to explore more. So diving back into the observations then, and I'll try and race through some of these. We see when we look at the disciplines that computer science and health research dominate at least the academic publishing destinations for writing on data governance, but data governance is discussed in a long tail of other disciplines. So you've got a tree map here, the very large kind of light green being information and computer science publications sized relative to the number of papers published in that discipline. The more vibrant green at the bottom being medical and health science, the orange studies in human society, the red law and legal studies, and then we get into commerce and management, things in biology, environmental science, economics, all with some data governance discussions, but not as big a field. And with the exception of a few researchers in computing and management science, data governance is rarely the primary focus of academics' work. Rather, many people come to data governance as a result of working on particular data projects that have then raised a data governance issue that they've explored the edges of from their disciplinary standpoint. So this means that much work might be thought of as applied data governance study, discussing what it means to manage and govern new data sets or data infrastructures for, say, cancer research or regional tourism planning or civil engineering, digital twins projects. But it also means that the ideas and innovations that come from approaching data governance in these different spaces might end up getting lost in disciplinary silos, not yet brought together as part of a cross-cutting field. And so we look at that as well in a co-citation analysis. So this network diagram shows some of the authors writing about data governance close to the others they're writing with or referencing. And for instance, we've got a cluster in the middle there around Boris Otto, revealing authors writing on data quality management and enterprise use of data in supply chains, and more recently on the idea of data spaces as multi-sided platforms for secure data exchange. And then still in computer science, we've got a yellow cluster around Al-Ruhith, that's got authors focusing on cloud computing, blockchain, big data analytics, in sensitive domains, including health and social media mining. And we've got there a lot of work that discusses data management to drive the exploitable value of data, calling for work on value-driven data governance, which is quite distinct from values-driven data governance, one character difference, but in other parts of this landscape. So whereas some authors are looking within single private sector institutions discussing what does data governance mean for the enterprise, others are discussing what does data governance mean for society or for particular social sectors. Particularly we see that in the health research. But interestingly here, when we look at who's writing on health and data governance, it crops up in lots of different parts of this map. So we've got the neuroscience-focused researchers thinking about the ethical issues in the construction of global research data sets in a light blue cluster to the left of this map. And then we've got a set of loosely connected clusters of health researchers at the top of the diagram, variously looking at the governance of patient records or data from wearables, or the interplay between technical and policy measures that can support cross-organizational data sharing. And within these health clusters, interestingly, for the work I now do with Connected by Data, sort of saw quite a lot of work on the topic of participation, providing models for more participatory data governance that draws on histories in those fields of patient and public involvement in general health policy. But notably, it appears that learning often stays in those silos and it's quite slowly picked up in other sectors, often without the substantial theoretical frameworks that can support translation between contexts. So because it's sort of only theorized from the perspective of that domain, it's hard to then transfer some of that knowledge. Now, I could spend a lot of time just exploring these networks, but I'm just going to make remarks around two other clusters of note. One, the dark blue cluster out to the right of the diagram represents writing on Indigenous data governance. It's an area of considerable activity in theorizing and thinking about models of data governance, but you can see it's quite loosely connected. It's pushed out to the edge, a dense network of people referencing each other, but relatively limited connections into the wider debates, something that we might see in some other areas too. And then a very small cluster, the light green bridge between those Indigenous data sovereignty writers and some of the health research, represents some writers talking about data trusts, a theme that as of 2021 saw relatively limited coverage in the academic literature, even though when we look at the grey and the policy literature, it's much more present there. So ultimately, what we're seeing is that talk of data governance is deployed to address a wide range of practical issues, but often with reaching for a relatively limited set of conceptual tools to address those issues based on existing disciplinary toolkits and biases. That really came out when we started looking at the keywords in papers and the co-occurrence of terms. So this diagram based on extracting salient terms from the titles and abstracts of over 600 papers gave us this rather surprising fish diagram, which we've come back to a few times. So there's three clusters coloured there in the tail of the diagram showing densely connected terms around data management. They're in red, predominantly health data topics in blue, and what we might call public policy issues of rights, citizens, capacity building in green. And then this set of terms in yellow that are more related to the legal frameworks around data that sit as outliers, more or less indicating or giving us a hint that legal discussions are rarely meeting in journal paper abstracts, at least, with some of those more practical data governance concerns. And we did some further work looking at terms.
We just have like a couple of minutes more.
I'm 2 seconds away from the 2 minutes away from the last bit. So we look further at term co-occurrence. We've built a network using Kumu where we can interactively explore this. I think the link will be in the final paper. And there, really the headline is that policy literatures have been bringing new terms and concepts into the debate. Academic literature naturally lags behind that to some extent, but it does suggest that there's a real chance for more bridge building there. And lastly, in the paper, we take a step back from the data governance writing to ask what can writing on the data sphere bring to this, and how can that help us? And as Caroline introduced, the idea of the data sphere has these three terms: data, human groups, and norms, and draws upon the idea of those interacting in a complex system. So in the closing section of the paper, we start to sketch out how this framework could be used to enrich an analysis of the data governance field, firstly as a descriptive framework to better understand what the data governance literature is really about, naming the data sets, human groups, and norms invoked in any particular discussion of data governance to help us better find those connections across silos and find people working on common problems in different disciplines, which is quite hard to track down using current conceptual tools. Secondly, building on that to support the transferability of innovation from one setting to another. For example, noting that participatory processes deployed in health data governance don't necessarily immediately translate in the same way to, say, justice data governance. But when we unpack the norms, the human groups, the assumptions involved, we can much better have that cross-learning. And thirdly, we highlight that it's useful to see knowledge production about data governance itself as a complex adaptive system, and to explore how ongoing use of bibliometrics, building on some prior Datasphere work on this at the end of last year, could help plot and monitor interventions in this space. So to leave it here, ultimately, though the idea of a Datasphere can feel like a neologism that further abstracts data governance, well deployed, it should do the opposite. And as I hopefully will see from the many Datasphere fellow presentations coming up, it's really about grounding data in these specific contexts that we get to understand and develop new ways of approaching these problems of balancing the benefits, harms, and securing the public good from data.
Thank you so much, team. And it was indeed an incredible work, so many months to see the evolution of bibliography. I just want to pass the word for our commentator, Bertrand. Please, Bertrand, and if anybody has any comments, raise your hands, and then we're going to have a little discussion after Bertrand comments.
Thank you, Carolina. I'm Bertrand de la Chapelle. I'm the Chief Vision Officer of the Datasphere Initiative. And I cannot encourage you more to read the document that Tim has presented, which is a very extensive work and research on the terms of data governance and the trends that are there. And I would say as a starting comment that it's a fascinating illustration of how data keeps feeding and breeding itself, because this is about data analysis on data itself. And this is the reason why the Datasphere is growing at such an amazing pace, because the data sets are constantly improving the more people do analysis about data. But there are three things quickly that I want to share with you. There was the insistence on the notion of silos between the different academic sectors, but also among clusters of research. Those of you who know me know that I'm a big proponent of the notion of a hypergraph and the interconnection between different elements. What the research of Tim shows is that although there are clusters of activities and there are silos of academic disciplines, they are all connected in different ways. And what is interesting is the notion that the term data governance is actually something that we believe can emerge as a sort of umbrella concept for a lot of other disciplines, rather than being a sub-element of what the such disciplines are doing. And I would transpose that in the field of policymaking, because bridging silos and spaces where things are discussed is also extremely important. Discussions on privacy have an impact actually on security or in trade, and vice versa. And so it is necessary, another illustration of a message that we have put forward, which is the need for a holistic and a systems approach for the three dimensions of the Datasphere. Quickly, the two other things is, it is interesting that we're talking about data governance, but the more I was reading Tim's document and the more we were discussing together, the more it goes and points in the direction of not only data governance, but the governance of the data sphere as a whole, i.e. what is the distribution of roles and responsibilities among the different actors and all the human groups that in one way or the other, by their own behavior or by the setting up of terms of service, norms, regulations, licenses or contracts, actually help structure the governance of the data sphere. And I think it's an important element to think about, because it is not absolutely certain, far from it, that the existing architectural or institutional systems are up to speed to handle the governance of the data sphere. And there probably will be a need to have new types of institutions, new types of arrangements, new types of frameworks to organize the relationship between different actors, and particularly across borders. And the other element in this governance of the data sphere is that here, more than anywhere else, there is a close interconnection between the technical layer and the policy layers. And at the moment, they're very separated. And we need to think in terms of agile frameworks, and we need to think in terms of technology-enabled regulations and vice versa, regulations that do take into account the evolution of technology in a time-resistant, time-resilient manner in a certain way. And this requires probably much more interactions between the policymakers and the people who develop the technology, because there are some things in technology that might allow some policy regulations to be lighter and more easily implementable. And vice versa, there are some regulations that are completely in contradiction potentially with the technical developments and the logics of the technical layer. So mutual education and making sure that we have technically enabled policies is important. And finally, a lot of teams' work has been about words and terminologies and the use of words. One of the big challenges whenever you talk about policy is that people do not necessarily share the same vernacular. And I would like to take one example that we may have the opportunity to discuss further in this meeting, is that we see at the moment the emergence of a lot of expressions around data collectives, data cooperatives, data collaboratives, data fiduciaries, data trusts, data stewardships, to describe in general a diversity of structures and data communities whose purpose is to share data among themselves or to pool data to share it with other actors. And I think it is really important to foster a better understanding of the wording that we use when we talk about data sharing. There's a morass of definitions. And what is most important is that regulations, such as the Data Governance Act or the Data Act in Europe, are making definitions for those words, for data cooperatives or data collectives. And we run the risk of having different legislations making different definitions for those expressions, which brings or may bring legal uncertainty for the actors, especially when they want to deal across borders. So we need to discuss this question of terminologies and to bring together those who work already on doing taxonomies. And I mentioned two who are actually participating in this call, including ABTI and the Ostrom workshop, who will be speaking with later in this event, but also making the connection with the policymakers who are not necessarily fully aware of what impact the right choice of terminology has and how the embedding of a particular definition in legislation may have a real life impact on how people can actually cooperate and share data. So these are the few elements: silos and bridging them, governance of the data sphere, not only governance of data, and importance of terminology, particularly around how do we qualify the data communities. And I hope that we will have the opportunity to continue this, this work and this type of analysis of literature around those elements. But I really recommend that you look at the document that Tim has prepared. It's a very interesting reading.
Thank you so much, Bertrand. I couldn't agree more with your commentary, and I just want to make sure that I mention what Mike Nelson was saying. Let's not forget about data unions, right? The multiplication of terminologies around these collectives. Yes. I just want to open to the floor for a couple of minutes. If anybody wants to comment or make any questions, let me know. I'm looking here. Any of the other fellows? Well, for me, it was really, okay, Mike, to you.
Just real quick, in my experience, the term data governance has been used in two very different roles for 25, 30 years. It's been a IT management term about managing the data inside your corporation. And only in the last 5 years have the policy wonks kind of taken this term and used it to talk about regulatory frameworks and standards and procurement requirements that might pertain to how the community does data. In your paper, do you try to distinguish between the two, or is there any guidance you would give us? Because when you Google on the term data governance, you get a whole bunch of tutorials on how to be a good CIO.
And Ting, if you want to share that specific slide again with the time when the term started to catch up, that is
well, that's, as I said, the first big bump that was back in the mainframe days,
and it was very interesting to see, Mike, because even like when you talk with the policy community, right, doing data privacy and open data back in the day when folks were discussing access to information and government transparency, right? They were still not using data governance as a all-encompassing, and I think that has changed.
As near as I can tell, it's a term that internet governance people decided to use because they wanted to have a larger portfolio.
Well, but it's not just that, right? I think there are more and more governments trying to develop their own national data strategies, right? At the city level, but at the national level and the regional level, even through trade agreements. Yeah. So we all need name, right? Lorraine always tells this story about one of the Gabriel Garcia Marquez books that we need words so we know what we are talking about and we can build things together, right? And I think data governance comes as an all-encompassing team. I read so many times the paper. Sorry, you are the one that needs to talk, not me.
No. And I'm trying to remember, we had quite a section on this, exactly that point, Mike, I think in an early draft, and it sort of probably is not there as explicitly structured, but this fact that you do have a couple of very clear paths. So one of the key things is whenever you see someone talking data governance, it's worth looking, what's their history? Where are they coming from? Are they coming from that data management to data governance inside the enterprise? Are they coming from social policy governance? I think what becomes interesting is it's not now that both the terminology is overlapping, but also the issues start to overlap. Yeah. So you can no longer manage data within a single enterprise. And there's a real gap in theorizing, even in that management literature, about cross-boundary data sharing, cross-jurisdictional. A lot of the literature kind of simplifies by assuming the enterprise is a nicely boundaried thing, or the enterprise is working within one jurisdiction. When you get case studies, they kind of look at things in a single jurisdiction rather than those cross-border flows. There's some that's getting more, particularly the stuff that talks cloud data governance, actually starts getting into that, seen from another point of view, it's cross-border data governance, it's international data governance that they're dealing with, but they're dealing with it from a very
Well, it would be nice if we could subdivide the international data governance issues from the corporate data governance issues from the open data, government data governance. Anyway, thank you very much for your work. This is very helpful, and I look forward to talking to you a bit about this further.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, so I think I'm gonna move forward so we don't get too late in our agenda. I do wanna say that a new version of the paper that will take in consideration the comments from the commentators and the participants will be presented at the IGF later this year. So please keep an eye on that. And you all received the draft version of the paper. So please do send comments to us so we can review and incorporate. And one of the things that I think it accompanies the literature review is the Datasphere Governance Atlas, right? Where we actually mapped over 260 organizations in the field and shows a lot this convergence of fields from folks working privacy, open data, and even international organizations really perhaps organically converging around the data governance field. So moving forward to our next panel, and thank you all so much, and thank you, Mike, and all the others for comments in the chat. we move into our second section on thinking global to collaboratively govern the data sphere. Some of our fellows will share their research on data governance in their region and why global externalities and impacts need to be better understood and addressed in research and policy making. So Bertrand, I invite you again to moderate this panel, and we then gonna hear from Francesco Vogel-Lazang, Christian Perroni, and Nachilongo Gervasius. We're gonna have the honor to be joined by two commentators, Beatriz Botero, who is the Assistant Professor of Law at Sciences Po, and Angie Raymond, who is the Director of the Program on Data Management and Information Governance at the Ostrom Workshop. Thank you all. Bertrand.
Thank you, Carolina. I'm there again. This session is an interesting one because I think we know when we talk about the data sphere that everybody, and particularly every government, is facing the same dilemma that we described with Lorraine Porciuncula in the We Need to Talk About Data report that we produced last year. And basically the dilemma is the tension between the aspiration to free flow of data and the desire to benefit from the exchange and not the trade of data, but the data that is produced somewhere else, and the notion of data sovereignty, which for many reasons is something that is a concept getting a lot of traction in the environment, in the policy environment. So this tension is everywhere. But what is striking is that there are different ways to address this tension in different regions, also given the different situations of countries or actors in the different regions. The situation is not necessarily the same. A country in Asia, a country in Africa, a country in Europe or Latin America. And so in the larger work that we're doing at the Datasphere Initiative, we are initiating a series of dialogues and views on the regulation of data from the different regions. And the first one, as Carolina was mentioning, will be on the views from Europe. But we have selected for this call today, this webinar, 3 out of the fellows who present a perspective that come from Europe, from Latin America and Africa. And basically, one of the objectives is to ask them, how does the problem of data governance and the policies look from their vantage point? And I will start with Francesco Vogel-Lazang, who is a fellow of the Datasphere Initiative, but is also a policy analyst at the Open Future Foundation. And focusing particularly on the European perspective and the Data Governance Act and the Data Act, you have studied in particular the question of how much the EU puts on the geographic approach to data, not only on personal data, but non-personal. And my question is basically, what are the global implications of the European approach that you see? How can it scale positively if it's replicated around the world with copycat legislations? And how do you see the European perspective regarding data on the basis of the current data strategy?
Thanks a lot, Bertrand, for this question, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I would say that the starting point for any sort of analysis of the European data governance ecosystem needs to be the European Strategy for Data, which was published in 2020. And there we see, I would say, an ambition to really develop a third way of European data governance around industrial data that could compete with the so-called American market-based approach and the Chinese state-based approach. And the winning formula, at least like in Thierry Breton-Worth, who is the Commissioner for Internal Market, is to foster access while protecting fundamental rights. And there is an emblematic quote in the strategy which I like to quote a lot, which goes that the winners of today will not necessarily be the winners of tomorrow in data governance debates. So there is really this ambition to foster access and sharing of industrial data within the European context while On the other hand, preventing conflicts with union law when data is transferred to third countries. And there are, I would say, three main lenses that you could adopt when approaching this topic. The first one is, of course, a protection argument. So the prevention of conflicts with union law is driven by imperatives about protecting citizens, European citizens in the online sphere. And even if the focus is on non-personal data, since both the DGA and the DA tackle also cross-border data flows of non-personal data, the idea is to making sure that there is a sufficient level of protection of that data when it leaves Europe. So here data is a protection argument, even if it is non-personal data. Then you could also have a protectionist argument here. Data itself, especially industrial data sharing, fosters value creation locally. And here, by creating new rules that somehow prevent access to data held in Europe, stored in Europe, you could say that there is an ambition to increase investments localization in data by actually hoarding and storing data in the geographical originating region. And then the final one, which is the one that I like to refer the most and I find most interesting, is this idea of a geopolitical argument of the European strategy for data. And here we can see how the EU, by leveraging its position as a global trendsetter in data regulation, tries to impact third countries' legal regime in a way to foster legal emulation. And this happened already with the GDPR previously in 2016. We saw how it almost became a global gold standard in data protection. And perhaps there is a similar ambition for the EU to foster convergence of third countries' legal regimes with its rules on non-personal data protection. And as a bottom line, depending on which kind of argument you want to adopt, which kind of lens you want to take, I would say that there is an important takeaway from legal activity in this field, which is something that I based my fellowship product and research, which is this emergence of geographical European data, which could actually be seen as a new conceptualization of data that goes beyond a very simple distinction between personal and non-personal data, but rather focuses on the idea of provenance, on the principle of geographical origins. So what will matter here is actually fostering access within a specific region to foster allocation of value internally in the European internal market, while preventing situations where data could lead to a comparative disadvantage vis-a-vis third countries. And of course, in terms of access, this has many repercussions because it has an extra layer to the complexity surrounding global data flows, especially for non-personal data. Both the DA, so the Data Act, and the Data Governance Act mostly target business sensitive information, IP protected data, and trade secrets data, and therefore foster an ongoing fragmentation of the data landscape that we see nowadays.
Thank you so much, Francesco. I have two other people now, and I know that Angie Raymond will have a hard stop at 3:10. So I will maybe go to Christian Perron right now, and if Nashi Longo allows me, I will ask Angie to come in just after the presentation by Christian Perron, and then we can continue. So Christian, you're a policy consultant and the head of rights and technology at ITS Rio. And I know that you've been working on an issue that is close to the work that we've done at Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, which is cross-border access to electronic evidence. It is a difficult issue that other actors actually in the group of fellows have been working on as well. That includes ASAP Lubin. I want to ask you how this issue impacts the debate about data governance, data flow, and data localization, and what is the perspective from Brazil in that regard?
Thank you very much, Bertrand. And it's a very interesting question. And I would like to start my answer and trying to unpack how I see the problem itself, how I see the dilemma that you mentioned in the beginning. So I see that we have a situation that's paradoxical. So we have a global technology, the internet. We have an international phenomenon, which is cross-border data. And we have mostly national legislation. This creates a situation where most of the countries, they decide to try to encompass the whole international cross-border phenomena in their own national legislation. And this also end up having an impact on how they deal with access to electronic evidence, particularly. From the standpoint of Brazil, there is a huge discussion whether a national piece of legislation can grant the law enforcement agencies direct access or direct capabilities of requesting access to data overseas, stored overseas. No matter the provenance of the data, no matter where the data actually is, and what is most importantly in this case, no matter whether there is any other piece of legislation that would block their access to these types of data. This creates a situation where there is a very clear potential overlapping of legislations, and particularly a potential for conflict of legislations. But if you look from the standpoint, of unilateral standpoint of the law enforcement agencies or the judges or the judiciary in Brazil, the question is a matter of data sovereignty, or it is a question of expediency, of having the capabilities of solving criminal cases, or having the capabilities of finding criminals in general, solving any cases that are in front of them. And if you look only through those lenses, it's very difficult to see the repercussions that it may have in other countries or towards a more broad, holistic view. That's why the Datasphere initiatives create an opportunity for us to see and reconceptualize this process, moving forward from this unilateral view to a much more holistic view, in the sense that you can understand repercussions in at least 4 different layers. One particular layer that you already mentioned in the past, which is sort of the technical dimension layer. So sometimes when you regulate unilaterally from only your national standpoint, you don't see that it may have impacts, for instance, in technical standards. For instance, if you require encryption or you require not to have encryption on data, this may have an international global repercussion much beyond what we are talking specifically on having access or not having access to e-evidence. There's another layer, which is the private layer. We were discussing about the different roles and responsibilities that the actors may have within this field. And what I say is that whenever we do not look at the different conflicts of legislation, and we end up placing this responsibility and this role in the private actors, particularly in intermediaries, because they will have to solve which piece of legislation they will comply with, either the order from Brazil or from any country, or the legislation that's blocking whenever or whatever they are. There's also, in terms of private actors, there's also the impact of individuals. So how they can themselves actually protect their interests and protect their rights. In terms of how to protect their rights, this leads us to a third layer, which is a governmental public layer, which you have what you mentioned as replicated around the world. Pieces of legislation replicated around the world, which I say it's sort of also a matter of reciprocity. So some country may say, well, if you can have access to the data that's stored in my country, I may have access to the ones that are stored in yours. And this creates a situation that may escalate towards also what you have called, Bertrand, in the past, the legal arms race to a certain extent. And to a fourth layer, this also allows us to see it's how to protect our culture and values, how to imprint from the standpoint of the global south or the majority world, how we can imprint our own values. Whenever there is a lot of regulatory competition in between different countries, how we can protect the usages that we want from our own data. So Europe, for instance, Francesco mentioned, is creating this geographical logic towards their data, this provenance idea, but not all countries, not all regions are capable of having this same impact worldwide. So this creates an imbalance between the different regions and different countries. And the interesting thing is that when you look at this from the standpoint of the data sphere, you can see all these layers much beyond the provincial discussion that's happening in Brazil, whether you have sovereignty over that data or not. And that's the interesting and the beauty that this initiatives gives us. In my research, it goes a little bit beyond trying to unpack this from the standpoint of how can a judge approach this situation through the lenses, to a much holistic lenses from the data sphere. So I give a little bit of some criteria that may be used, for instance, the nationality of the person involved, whether this has a blocking legislation in another country, whether it can have a conflict, whether this can have an impact on the technical standards. So we try to unpack all these questions in order to have a much better understanding from the standpoint of the judges, but this can also go from the standpoint of the regulatory bodies. And that's my second view on international data transfers and how can supervisory authorities regulate that. That's the beauty of having the Datasphere concept. It helps us navigate this complexity and of this paradox through a much better lenses, much more global, and a lenses that allows us to see that we can and should move beyond a unilateral standpoint to a much more interoperable standpoint. And I leave you with that. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Christian. And this is touching upon the whole question of the battle between territoriality and extraterritoriality, and also the key question of scalability and replication, as we said, something we've discussed with Francesco in the context of a paper that is preparing regarding what kind of categoric imperative is or should be kept in mind by legislators when they develop something. In other terms, shouldn't every country think about how they would feel if they were on the receiving end of the legislation, the extraterritorial legislation that they're developing? I think it would be an interesting impact assessment. Nashilengo, if you don't mind, I will now pass the floor and the baton to Angie Raymond. And I'll come back to you, Nashilengo, just afterwards, because she has a direct constraint. So Angie is the director of the Program on Data Management and Information Governance as the Ostrom workshop in Bloomington, Indiana. And for those of you who are familiar with the work of Elinor Ostrom, it has been remarkably focused on the notion of governance of commons in a way that is exploring the third avenue between what is pure public management of commons and privatization of commons. We had a fascinating discussion a few days ago with Angie, and we were talking about the question of taxonomies, as I mentioned earlier, a notion of charters for data communities and the transaction cost of data sharing. But Angie, how do you see the application of the Ostrom framework to things that are non-revelers and the application to data governance? How do you see the challenge of moving between the global and the local dimensions?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, and apologies. They're both being nice and not telling you that part of my responsibility is to also be an educator. So there's an exam today, and students, get really stressed when you're not standing there when the exam time starts. So I appreciate you indulging me on this. It is a true hard stop for me, or you'll start hearing the pounding on my door. So let me say, first of all, I do want to note that all of this, that I've heard today, first of all, resonates, and I'm so appreciative that there's a global community that's adding their voice to this. And I think it's important to know that, for example, Susan Aronson, who I don't see on the call, but I know she's someone that has certainly talked with you all at various times, talks about, data flows and, this conversation, and it actually goes directly to the question. So I'm not way off point. I also think there's that interesting conversation about the definition of data governance, again, demonstrates that we still exist in silos. And again, this is going toward my point. But it's pretty common, and it's not unique, certainly to us, that, we're sitting in a room, we come up with a phrase that sounds completely logical, and we look around 3 or 4 years later and realize, if a couple of computer scientists had been in the room, they probably would have told us don't use the term data governance, right? So these are interesting conversations, and quite frankly, I push back on Susan Aronson oftentimes because she's adopted and is trying to smush this into existing institutions, and is probably doing, I think, a hard road of work to try to think of data flows within the concept of trade. And so this goes directly to the question of, in a situation where we have non-rivalrous data, what I was going to say, for example, as it relates to the cross-border data flows, we're sort of, this particular issue has to do with scope, right? My data is always cross borders. I love going to London, and I'm in Bloomington, Indiana right now. So my physical presence in data, my physical presence in London creates a data set in London, as does my passport. I made the really interesting decision of being in the biometric system, but did it in the UK for those of you who know how the US system is, a very specific reason. So those type of conversations, I would suggest to us, we need to be careful that we don't just try to treat this as either just a trade commodity or anything similar to that. And what we need to begin to understand is we've always had data flows that cross borders. It's just now at a scale that we are unable to truly appreciate. And so when we think about this in that conversation, the question is, do we have any, in my opinion, do we have any models that fit? And I would suggest to you right now, we may or may not, but it's certainly not something like trade. That narrative of we have to, think of these as having to be free flowing for the purposes of finance, commerce, or anything like that just scares the bejemonis out of me, or including national security. I'm sorry. I reject that as a framework of my data must be everywhere so that you can secure a border somewhere else. I'm not a threat to you, nor am I a threat to anyone here. And so dial that rhetoric back about half a notch. I will tell you, in my opinion, there is a really interesting place that we could look at, and it is an example that I use a lot of places. And for those of you who are hopefully familiar with it, it is in fact the New York Convention that governs arbitration awards. This is a convention in particular that literally, if your country signs up, for those who are uninitiated in this, if your country signs on to the New York Convention, it puts into your national law an order that the courts cannot hold hearings, must stay hearings, and send the parties to arbitration. This is a massive convention and an incredible agreement. And I've used this as an example in many instances because it's very simple, it's very straightforward. It allows the local countries to retain the autonomy of what they in that sphere, call public policy issues. And we need to, flesh that up a little bit. But that's sort of my question is there not a framework somewhere that we can sort of agree on these 10 main principles? And then what we do is reserve rights locally for them to still protect their citizens and their court systems, quite frankly, from intrusion in these areas. I honestly think that the more we silo this and try to, walk down paths of siloed behavior, either based on the nature of the data itself or the purpose of the sharing, really misses the fact that my data is everywhere. It also oftentimes is going to miss the fact that my data is everywhere. And I am a Midwest American white female. And there are a lot of people that will tell you that's a wonderful framework to think about, but my data is nowhere. No one is thinking about me at all. And this is part of what I am growing increasingly concerned about. There's tons of initiatives. And the question is then, how do we promote that global conversation so we understand that we actually have two poles? We have a group of individuals that our data is potentially everywhere. Citibank, Bank of America, fill in the blank, my data is everywhere. And we have this other group that are deeply underrepresented. And we're now going to create this new digital divide or data divide, quite possibly. And that worries me deeply. So that's my argument about non-rivalrous, right? Or the beginning of it. This idea that, the historic way that the Ostroms looked at this, or not this issue, but in general, is a very useful place to start. And certainly I do all the time. But we are actively working and expanding this into non-rivalrous environments. And the question is, how do we do that? Or do we begin to recognize the complexity of there are actually actors who behave as if data is rivalrous, that they have control over it, they maintain control, and they commercialize it 100%. In the United States, the best example of that, for example, is Monsanto, that literally just gobbles up data and then doesn't share it at all, just full stop. So there is examples of rivalrous data, right? There are situations where there is, in fact, entities gobbling up data and creating this rivalry. But then we also have these other situations where it is, in fact, the case that our data is just everywhere and it doesn't even have to be shared. It can just be by the fact that I'm on an airplane and I'm in another country. And then the third issue that I want to point out is, again, the fact that we do have these two very polar examples of people individuals and entities and countries whose data is everywhere. And then we have sort of the forgotten. And quite honestly, there's a lot of forgottens. And the question is, if we're going to move into one of these systems, we can't recreate existing institutions that, quite frankly, continue to embed the forgottenness of these areas of the world. Did you have a second question or?
No, that's okay. And unfortunately, the time
I know
for this is limited, and we had fascinating discussions. Before, I want to just pick quickly on two things before going to Nashilongo. I think there is something that is missing in the whole debate, which is in the policy debate, is that at the moment on the internet, free flow is and was from the onset the default.
That's right.
And it's the complete opposite from what trade was or has
That's
been,
right.
where you have to open up trade. We don't have to enable free flow. They are there. We are just discussing when are restrictions legitimate. And the second thing is, you were making the comment that, and the analogy with trade is probably not a good one. I cannot miss the opportunity to reiterate that data is the new oil is the worst analogy you can imagine.
Yeah.
And there, I just heard somebody mentioning another one that is probably better, as data is the new soil, which is a fun pun on using the word. Thank you so much, Angie. Have a good exam.
Thank you all. Oh, sorry. Thank you for indulging me. I am going to try to get back once they are, settled. You know how it works. They settle and then they don't pay attention to me at all. So I'm hoping to make it back. I'm hoping everything goes the way it's supposed to, and I'm hoping to make it back. So I hope to join you all during the discussion in a bit. Thank you for having me if I don't see you again. Thank you.
So Nashilongo, thank you for having been patient. You are a fellow of the Datasphere Initiative, but you're also the founding president of the Internet Society chapter in Namibia, and also the founder and the managing consultant of Namchue Digital. And you are also, I think it's interesting to mention, and that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you. So you're in Namibia, but you're also part of the presidential task force on the fourth industrial revolution in Namibia. And
That's
so
right.
Tell us more about how things are being viewed from Africa. And you know that the Datasphere Initiative and INGPN have ongoing dialogues on policy issues and digital policy issues in Africa. But how do you see that from your perspective and your location and Africa?
Thank you, Bertrand, and thank you, everyone, my colleagues, the fellows, and the teams at the Data Initiative for organizing this. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. I've been listening to my fellow colleagues in their interventions and hearing very good perspectives, especially from the Europe, given your data laws that for sometimes you've been trying to applicate or replicate here. But let me start by saying that we, within the African region, and even maybe I'll start from Namibia, is that we're seeing that data governance is dealt with in silos. From local perspective, I think in one of my research, I've reflected how data, even from the public data, is held in systems that are owned, donated, maybe bought from developing countries, and held in those systems that locals can't even manage, can't even input, can't even make changes, for instance. So I remember we had one of the government ministry that has 7 different data systems, and some from India, from Russia, from just think about any other place that could have advanced data management systems. And none of these are not operable to each other. So we have those many issues. So we found data collected, obviously, from data subjects, not interoperable, but also not reusable, even within the same public sector. And that's literally the same also within the private sector. So local level, corporate organizations also want to keep their data to themselves for competition, I want to believe. And only abides to corporate governance regulations. And this is tricky, especially for countries where no data protection laws, for instance, are in place. I know that a number of the countries within the regions have their laws in places. I think out of the 54 countries on the African region, I think a few months ago, over 32 had their laws in place. But we have those challenges. We're also dealing with challenges where citizens as data subjects have very limited understanding on their rights as data subjects. And in most of the cases, they find themselves having to bargain on giving up their data with, accessing public services, because that's the case in many of the countries where you need to have, you want services, you have to leave your data or your details somewhere else, and you do not know how that is governed, for instance. We're also seeing that governments are really battling on where emphasis should be at national level because of very competing national development issues. And ICT, like in my country, is really just seen as an enabler and not a key national sector. And of course, we've been at regional level again, seeing challenges or facing challenges such as lack of regional integration, for instance. There's no regional framework on how data governance should look like. I mean, we have regional law that has been developed, but even member nations, for instance, from the African Union level, not too keen on endorsing the law and making sure that everybody abides by it. So we have those many challenges. What we're also seeing is that especially engaging with policymakers, is that there's this view of data colonialization to a certain extent. And this is due to who and where the global larger collectors of data are coming from. And a lot of those also comes with sentiments such as, for instance, the bigger titans within internet and technology who uses data for fueling the businesses of their work, lacks, for instance, data investment within the Africa region. So there are those many issues. Bertrand, I know that you have reflected a bit on our work, on my work, especially within the country as member of the Presidential Task Force on the 4IR. And I think if my previous response hasn't captured it, it's really those are the challenges that we're finding. I mean, as a smaller country, very developing, we find out that bigger corporates, for instance, that are investing within the country would rather save their data or have data somewhere else. For instance, we have bigger banks from South Africa, and so they would rather have the data, corporate data based in South Africa, and then research and development is also then done outside of the country. And so that puts a question of data value, right? Like if there's so much data value, for instance, that it can go into research and development, so why isn't that value being recognized, being replicated, bringing value to the country as a whole? So yeah, those are the many challenges. I hope I'll be able to get a chance and come back and reflect a little bit more. Thanks, Bertrand.
Thank you so much. And you touched upon a certain number of things, including the question of standardization, the formats, and this is something that we will come back later to, as Cassie Raymond is also addressing the question of standardization, national statistics, and so on. But I want to just close with your last point regarding the distribution of value is actually different from the distribution of data. And maintaining the data in one place doesn't guarantee that there will be value that is going to be produced from it. And likewise, if the value of the data is aggregated somewhere else, there is a general question regarding the equitable distribution of the value that is being produced by data. So the extremes of massive hoarding and making the data accessible versus massive localization that prevents it from being accessible. These are two extremes that are both detrimental. Let me finish. Thank you so much, Nashilongo. Let me finish now with a second commentator, with Beatrice Botero, who is assistant professor of law at Sciences Po in Paris, but also affiliated with the Berkman Klein Center in the US. I have a question because I know that Beatrice has worked on a lot of issues regarding smart cities, and not only the questions of surveillance, which is a topic of hers, but also on the question of public-private partnerships. And particularly, I noticed that she wrote an article and explored the topic of compulsory sharing of data by private companies for public interest aspect, the data sharing ordinances, and also the question in Europe of the notion of data altruism. So I would like to ask you, Beatrice, to delve a little bit in this question of how to unlock the value of data by sharing data between public and private actors, either on a compulsory manner or on a non-compulsory manner.
Yes, thank you, Bernard, and thank you everyone for having me here. These are amazing presentations. So some of my work has been indeed on trying to understand the dynamics of data sharing between tech companies and cities, mostly platform economy, sharing economy firms, and then also the more direct companies procuring a particular service to cities. And one of the things that's been very interesting for me to observe, or was when I was doing that research, was that there would be two camps in the conversation. You would have, for example, the city on the one side, like saying we want this data because it helps us monitor traffic or pollution or whatever you were looking for. And you would have on the other side the tech company saying, no, that's my data. And the tech companies had like different arguments. So one of them was it's their They don't want it. It will also improve enforcement from the city. So of course they want to like keep that for themselves. They're also scared about some of that data being later released on open data portals and then hurting their competition and their competitive advantage. So the companies have like that corporate argument. But then interestingly, siding with the tech companies, you would see privacy advocacy organizations, very serious ones. And they were in fact stressed also about the surveillance risk associated with sharing data with city government, right? So one of the risks is, yes, it sounds very nice to share transportation data with the transportation department, but what if law enforcement has access to it? How do you guarantee? And then of course, like sort of the outcome of that research of mine is that there are smarter ways to share data. So one of them is very particular, and actually to the first presentation, one of the key questions that policymakers and maybe scholars thinking about this is exactly why do we want the data for? So you do end up in situations where you increasingly have local government officials, but I think this is true in government in general, that are hungry for data because it's the new oil and whatever, and the more data, the better. That might be decreasing recently in recent conversations. I think local governments or governments in general are stressed about cyber attacks. So they know that if they have a lot of data, the attack might hurt more. So they're all of a sudden, they don't want that much data. But increasingly, they were really hungry for data and wanted everything. And the cases that I liked and what I ended up like advocating for was, if you actually know what you want the data for, you only request what you need. And that's way more nuanced. It creates less risk, but also creates less surveillance risk. And then of course you can create an architecture which is both legal and technical internally to avoid actors that shouldn't have unrestricted access to the data, right? So you could have an internal policy that says, you know, even if the data has been shared already with the city government, the security department can only access it with a warrant or things like that, right? That creates some form of checks and balances. But I think what's interesting too, like out of my research and to the conversation we're having, is that it is in black and white, right? And I was actually pushing for data sharing. I'm a fan of data sharing and data altruism, but I think there are very valid arguments on different sides as to why we might want to be very careful about how data gets shared. And interestingly, I think also many tech companies have very serious privacy lawyers in-house who were raising some of this same arguments. So I guess that actually resonates with one of the things you're saying. One of the things that I would add, and this is maybe a little bit more about Francisco's presentation, is that one of the things I have observed in the territoriality of data sovereignty, I don't know enough about the African context, and Shilongo, to know if this is true of your field as well. But I think it's not only a conversation that our narrative that is increasingly about you don't get to surveil us, so we want some territoriality and some control. But it is also, if you map it against an increase in surveillance technologies and surveillance policies, it's me who gets to surveil my citizens. So it's not that the European Union is like totally anti-surveillance, right? You see expansive programs of surveillance in France, in Hungary, in Portugal, in whatever, and you see them lobbying very heavily in Brussels to keep those powers and keep the e-privacy directive like at bay. And so I think there's this interesting dynamic in which there's a redrawing of sovereignty and sovereignty as an exercise of power over citizens around these conversations of who gets to access what data, who surveys and why, and then of course the international partnerships, but that's too much. But thank you so much. This has been super, super interesting to hear. And I already have all the tabs open with all the blog posts and articles that I now definitely need to read.
Thank you so much. And we could have a full discussion with every single of the presenters. We don't have time for the sake of the schedule to have a session of question and answers right now, but please use the chat to make comments. And also we will have breakout sessions at the end of the main event. So please keep your questions, but use the chat as much as possible. And I bring the mic back to Carolina for the next session. Thank you so much.
And I will pass straight to Martin to lead the next session.
Exactly. I jumped right in. Hello, everybody. Such a pleasure to have heard the already, presented interventions. My name is Martin Hallin. I'm also one of the co-founders and acting as Deputy Executive Director of the Datasphere Initiative. And I'll have the pleasure now to also talk about this second side of the title of today when it comes to acting responsibly when unlocking the value of data. And today we'll hear from 4 fellows of the current cohort, and then also I call upon additional commentators. And as we've heard already over the course of the last hour, the term responsibility really is of key importance in the context of the work, not only of the Datasphere Initiative, but also in context of this whole ambiguity of the terminology that we have. And as some of you know, the mission of the Datasphere is to help create agile frameworks that responsibly unlock the value of data for all. And one key reason for usage of this term is also its multidimensionality and the fact that there's a wide range of importance of risk management and balances depending on the use cases. So to do this justice and to do justice to this wide range of what it means to unlock this value of data for all, we will hear from now 4 of our very amazing fellows what this would mean from their perspective and their particular area of expertise. And before calling upon the first one key theme in those interactions will also be the open question on how to best embed those conversations, not just as data conversations themselves, but in the wider data governance and particularly societal conversation, also referring back to what Beatrice was sharing with us at the beginning. And with this, I would like to now give the floor to Cassie Raymond, who is our DI fellow and at the moment also technical manager at the Global Burden of Animal Diseases and associated with Guelph University. And Cassie, given your work also on these topics, I would like to ask you to what extent the lack of data standards and data interoperability in some sectors might also hamper our ability to responsibly unlock the value of data to its fullest potential. And a reminder, if you could keep it to 3 to 5 minutes, that would be wonderful, because this way we can have everybody intervene, even though we are slightly running short of time. Please, Cassie. Yeah.
Thanks, Martin. Well, data interoperability and standards play an important role in the ability to discover, reuse, and leverage data. And in my work and during the fellowship, I look specifically at open national livestock population statistics and the way that they're categorized by different organizations and countries over time. So these statistics are very valuable. They're used in tracking progress towards the sustainable development goals, decision-making and policy, including understanding economics, modeling disease attribution, greenhouse gas emissions scenarios, animal productivity, antimicrobial resistance, and nutrition or protein availability. And interoperability is important in this aspect because data from the different sources that are described using different terms or without linkages to standards might hamper the ability to combine and leverage and unlock the value of data. And this creates challenges because when data is used, we have to understand what it means. So what do categories represent in the data? How are they defined? How they can be interoperable with other data sources? And when the data is not defined by metadata or standard definitions, it's ambiguous. So it can be interpreted in different ways, potentially leading to misuse if not understood in the way that was intended, and impact data quality through differing interpretations of categories by those collecting and using the data, and then understanding how this can propagate into models. It's also then challenging to combine and compare the data, and this is especially important when we want to compare across time or geographic regions. So throughout my fellowship, I cataloged and connected naming conventions for data categories used in livestock population data from organizations such as the FAO, Eurostat, and the World Organization for Animal Health. And the result yielded over 100 categories used across just 4 data sources. And this really pushed me to try to understand who's creating the standards and the governance structures surrounding their creation. And as Martin noted, these challenges are not only data conversations, but wider data governance and societal conversations. So suggestions to improve interoperability of data, such as through the adoption of international standards, are often siloed in technical and policy communities. Internationally adopted standards that allow for the categorization of the several uses of the data don't exist in all sectors. And in livestock agriculture, there has been many attempts by the technical community to create these standards, but little success in widely implementing them. The issue lies not only in the technical community, but in the legislation of organizations, governments, and unions that often influence the categories for reporting through national agricultural statistical policies and statistic policies in general. And this overlap isn't well documented in literature. So for instance, in some countries, typically in the global north, statistical acts and policies may mandate that national livestock population data be collected using specific categories. And these policies, the definitions of the categories are providing, almost acting as a vocabulary for the categories used in the data and giving it context. And this thereby influences the meaning of data and the interoperability of data between the different sources. So the data categories themselves are only part of the whole picture. And the concept of the data sphere allows us to reframe the debate and consider the challenges in interoperability in national data holistically, and to understand where responsibility lies in unlocking the value of data. So by considering the different norms, groups, and human dynamics shaping the data sphere, we're able to take a more nuanced approach to understanding the systems and key stakeholders and their unique responsibility and interoperability and standards who has to work together. So I hope this response opens a conversation so we can understand why it's difficult to create and implement these standards, whether it be because standards themselves don't welcome different views of data. So I'm thinking of Angie Raymond's comment about the invisible or forgotten, or because there's pressures to report, low funding and data stewardship within organizations producing, collecting, or aggregating data, or because of this policy and technical divide in implementation. So thank you to the Datasphere Initiative for giving me the opportunity to speak, and also GBADS and the University of Guelph for co-branding the event.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kerstin. Also, thank you for setting the stage, I think, for now this bigger discussion about responsibility. We're certainly only scratching the surface of the nuance that actually the term also transports within it. And with this, I would now like to hand over to you, Benjamin. Benjamin Akinmoyeye is also our current fellow of the 21-22 cohort and a ICT for development practitioner. And my question to you, Ben, would also be why you believe that data sharing and openness is part of this piece of responsibility to unlock the value of data, and in particular, what lesson you have seen and drawn from through your work in the health sector in Africa. So Ben, here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tim. Martin's right. Okay, so over the years, I've always thought when it came to the issue of data governance in particular, that sovereignty was the key way to go about it, because when you look at the power that the big tech held over data, there was no chance that African region has any chance to ever succeed in their data economy if the future economy is dependent on data. So I also bought the idea of data was the new oil. And I've always felt that patient was the most important person who all data in health sector, which was the area where I was interested in, had the biggest influence. So with this understanding, thinking Africa needed to build its own infrastructure so that they can have a seat at the table to be able to discuss and argue with the amount of data they have. That was my understanding. I kept arguing for data localization, data sovereignty, until I came into the fellowship for Datasphere Initiative. And something new came up that I'd always thought about before and I'd always participated in, which was internet governance, multi-stakeholderism. And at that point, it made sense to think about the different stakeholders involved in the agenda of data, and knowing fully well from the understanding about Datasphere that it's complex, it's multidimensional, and it involves a whole lot of players. And then I started looking at, okay, if there's so much argument and so much frictions around discussing the origin or the value or who benefits from data, if we pay attention to the primary object of healthcare, which is the patient, then the argument might actually change. And from that moment, I started looking at this argument from that perspective of the health data, who has the biggest implication on whatever happens to data, health data in particular. And from my initial work, it became obvious that most of the data that we have on the continent were housed outside of the continent. It was either being orchestrated by other players, especially international organizations that support interventions that collect data. And as you and I may know, whoever designs the data collection tools has the power over the data, no matter what you get out of the data, whoever designs the data tool. And from that point, I started arguing that we should create a culture where the data collection tools encourages the culture of the owners of the data. And from that point, it then means that the data that is gathered is easily shared, because now you know about me and I know about you. And then I can also get the best value out of it. And for me, for the first part of my work, it was about the patient, having a patient-centric approach into data governance. Let patients or the beneficiaries of or the subject of the data be involved in the decisions that is made around data governance. And this argument has not been very, very easy to have, especially when you are sitting across data privacy advocates, the privacy lawyers, and data protection enthusiasts. It's a very difficult conversation. But also when you gather data, you don't just gather data for the sake of data. You gather it because you want to share it. And that's where I believe responsible data sharing comes in. I wish I had published my last blog, which is saying you can't really have a strong data protection if there's no legitimate data sharing approach. And what I found out is that in all of this data privacy advocacy and conversation, there's always data sharing clauses. And these data sharing clauses are very silent. People don't talk about it. And in my next blog, I'm advocating that this part of this legislation should also be as loud as every other part of the regulations or legislations, that data sharing is important to give everybody a sense of necessary protection or privacy they require, if you know that there's a legitimate way of sharing. And that is my own argument right now. So I've become, Datasphere Initiative have turned me to a data sharing advocate, responsible data sharing advocate, to make sure that we can really get the value that data carries. So I hope I can just keep quiet here. And that is what I think my work has been about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. And thank you also for sharing your story of, this metamorphosis and of your experience, which of course, is one of the reasons I think why we also all come together to exactly, share this knowledge, but also not be afraid to question some of our predisposed thinking about this very complex ecosystem. So with this, I would now like to hand over also the floor to Magdalena Eva-Joźwiak, also one of our current fellows and a researcher and lecturer at Tilburg University. And from you, Magdalena, I'd like to also hear about kind of the expanded notion that kind of is linked to responsibility, because there's also the term of transparency that plays a big role, of course, within how data is being leveraged for specific purposes. And the question is, is it always with sufficient protections? So with this, Magdalena, the floor is yours. Please share with us what your perspective is on this.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would also like to thank to all the team of Datasphere Initiative who was so helpful and created such a great community for us in the past months to discuss ideas. Right, so I was part of my contribution and research as a fellow was on the concept of transparency in the context of Datasphere, and I approached transparency from a critical perspective, seeing how transparency has been very often used as this main normative tool for achieving accountability, while at the same time not really stimulating enough reflection, whether just having the framework of transparency connected to consent is enough. So I've noticed that transparency is very often used on individual level, where it is individuals who are exchanging their data for certain services, have occasion to accept the terms of data processing, and in that context, individuals whose data is being processed or about to be processed can accept the terms and see what will be done with their data. So that is this kind of transparency moment where one can agree or disagree to data processing. And apart from this very individualized level of transparency, other contexts where transparency has been touched upon or not enforced, but perhaps welcomed, is where big platforms have some kind of framework of self-regulation. And they leverage this regulatory framework as kind of showing to the world how ethically and transparently they go about their businesses. It has been called this ethics washing or transparency washing by some scholars. So those two approaches to transparency, which is one based on self-regulation and other based on individual consent, and the only moment where you can some kind of get insight into doings of businesses, are very much insufficient. The main problem with individualized consent is that individuals are simply, and it is connected with this data governance model where data is perceived as a commodity very much. So that is connected to individual level transparency. It very much disregards how individuals are actually equipped to control their data. The idea of individual level consent is very illusory because it stems from the premise that individuals actually are reasonable actors within this exchange, and they actually have power to refuse the terms on which this exchange of data versus services is being performed. And this is simply not the case, and it has been very nicely explored by some researchers who also coined this a term of digital resignations, showing how individuals actually very often are led to a situation of despair and simply wanting to stop engaging in any activities that might stimulate their agency in the digital world. They simply are being exhausted by the amount of information that's being shared with them, and that actually does not, the individual level of transparency does not contribute at all to any common action by individuals to make sure that there's some actual accountability. So those were my kind of the very negative outlooks of how transparency currently works. And from there, there are paths for developing how we can make sure that transparency is actually this actual tool for accountability in the context of data governance. And here there are several promising avenues. One of them being those community-based models of data governance, such as data cooperatives, data commons that were already discussed today. Another outlook could be dependence on this kind of constitutionalization of rights in the digital realm. So here there is this whole field of digital constitutionalism where actually there is this more institutionalized approach to governance of data, where governments actually regulate and make sure that companies that use data are bound to certain values, rather than having this bottom-up approach. So there are several different outlooks that might be the ways out of this conundrum where transparency actually has not been while being hailed as the solution to many problems, has not been really very effectively helping out. So that's where I will finish. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Magdalena, also for adding additional nuance to the term, yet another term, that in some cases is utilized in an oversimplified way, certainly. So given the sake of time and also the fact that we still want to hear a few additional perspectives, I'm quickly handing over now to Asaf Lubin, who is an associate professor at Indiana University. Asaf's background is a very interesting one, not only encompassing the security and cyber angle, but also fascinating awareness and also mastership of the legal aspects related to data. So I wanted to quickly ask you, Asaf, what also you believe the legal frameworks are for thinking, essentially through the management of data, and also to what extent the work that you've been accomplishing through your fellowship has supported, your ongoing activities. So Asaf, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marty. So the need to develop legal frameworks for the management of data has been on the agenda of the international community for a long time now. We've heard about it throughout the previous sessions. There's now a variety of binding and non-binding instruments, national legislation, and judicial decisions to regulate this area. I'm particularly an international lawyer, so I like to think about this from a public international law perspective. On the public international law side, there is still no universally recognized set of data governance rules at the international level, and the field remains extremely fragmented and weak. This is owed in part to the fact that the international human rights community has failed to recognize a customary standalone and well-defined right to data protection, nor are there any other standards derived from any other international law field, in part because international law is so siloed, a topic we've been discussing about for a very long time now. So law of the sea folks won't talk to law of the space folks who won't talk to human rights folks, and yet data cross-cuts across all of those fields. And there is an inability designed in the way we think about doctrinal public international law for thinking about these areas. But I come back to a report that the International Law Commission put together for almost 2 decades ago on the protection of personal data and the trans-border flow of information, in which they propose a set of 6 emerging norms for data management and governance. And those 6 norms, I think, will not be new to anyone who does data management or data protection. The first was the principle of lawful, fair, and transparent data collection and processing, which establishes that data must be processed in a way that respects the rule of law and is based on a limited legal ground for processing. The second is the principle of accuracy, which establishes a qualitative requirement whereby data undergoing processing shall remain accurate and where necessary kept up to date and complete for the purpose intended. The third is the principle of purpose and storage specification and limitation, which establishes the collection, subsequent storage of use of personal data should be explicitly limited to specific and legitimate purposes at the point of collection. The fourth is the principle of individual participation, according to which data subjects should possess certain claims or privileges concerning the management of their personal data. The fifth is the principle of integrity and confidentiality, which establishes that data should be protected by reasonable security safeguards, and unauthorized or accidental access, destruction, or use or modification should be prevented. And finally, the sixth is the principle of accountability, requiring a mechanism for ensuring due process, supervision, and legal sanction, such as through a data protection authority, to ensure that collectors and processors of data comply with these principles. Now, where I'm most interested in is the intersectionality of all of this in national security, because all we've been seeing in the space of the work of militaries, intelligence agencies, criminal investigation authorities is a derogation from these principles in the name of national security. And in fact, many data protection frameworks explicitly allow these types of derogations when the data is collected for public order, national security, or in the fight to prevent serious crime. And it is particularly in those areas that we come back to what Angie was talking about in the context of the forgotten, because the groups who are most vulnerable to these types of intrusions are those who will be operating in a national security environment. And so in my latest blog post, I talked about data in war. And now when we think about situations from Ukraine to Palestine, we think about these 6 principles that the ILC introduced, we can imagine how those could have been used to better protect the rights of the forgotten in those war zones, and how they have not been protected because militaries, quite frankly, simply do not abide by these principles in times of armed conflict. So the blog post has been shared, or I can share it, and it touches more on that, but I want to stay close to the timeline, so I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much, Asaf. Yes, and the link to the blog post that is fresh off the press has just been shared also in the chat. So wholeheartedly recommend a read also in context of the current geopolitical tensions that we all see. Much more relevant than we all would like it to be, not only for that reason. So Asaf, thank you so much also for the contributions. And to make right with the remaining minutes that we have before we move on to the closing, I would directly move on to our commentators. And the first one is Suha Mohammed, who's joining us from the Apti Institute in India. Thank you so much, Suha, for joining us today. Suha is in charge of strategy and partnerships there, and also has been contributing quite a bit to the ongoing discussions that we had within the Datasphere. And I would really like to just open it up a little bit and ask you also how the issues that you've heard now in context of responsibility, transparency, and also security resonate with you, the work that you're doing, and also if you have any other recommendations on areas that we might have missed or that would be worth investigating further. So Suha, please, would be lovely to hear your perspective.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. It's been really wonderful sort of hearing these different perspectives, and they feed into and resonate with much of the work that we do at Apti. Just a quick introduction. So the work at Apti and the Data Economy Lab specifically looks at the sort of paradigm of data stewardship. So many of those sort of concepts around data cooperatives, data commons, data trusts, exchanges, etc., are all models that we investigate in depth and are very curious about how they apply in different use cases, different sectors. And we look at this sort of multidimensionally. So we're very curious about the sort of policy landscape in which stewards inhabit and sort of what the different sort of capacities required are for stewards to really thrive. So both looking at community participation and mobilization around data. So I think it reflects on questions around transparency that were brought up by some of the speakers, both in terms of how communities are starting to understand the values of data, but also sort of the limitations and ways that how data literacy or a lack of data literacy can act as a barrier in being able to effectively understand those data rights and then connect with either the steward itself or with the sort of broader policy community as well. So I think we see those elements sort of really congregating, and part of our work at Apti has been looking at participatory data stewardship. So really touching on elements of transparency from the perspective of how users and users being both individuals and communities can sort of benefit most from the data, both by having access to the data itself, but also being part of decision-making around data. So who it's shared with and for what purposes. And I think we've come across a really interesting set of use cases that look at in particular sort of data cooperatives that look at these questions in more depth and look at questions that I believe were brought up by Cassie around sort of the different meanings of data and how they are often obscured by different populations. So how sort of data communities can actually be a part of standardizing and building out those standards on ground. And then sort of commenting more on Magdalena's sort of work around transparency and how that's often individualized. It's really important to look at sort of the collective value of data and how that can be established, identified through these sort of more collective structures and managements of data as well. So I think the other thing I'll say is that, and that was brought up quite significantly by many of the participants today, was around the question of vulnerability and about how many communities are sort of forgotten or not sort of considered in questions of data governance or rights. Part of that is a question of data literacy. Part of that is a question around how these structures are sort of, how accessible these structures are for people to voice their opinions, have access to accountability mechanisms around how their data is used and how it is deployed. And I think a big part of what we're doing is exploring that at a sort of legal and policy sort of level as well. I think in a country, or coming from a country that doesn't have a sort of robust data legislation or protection regulation at this point in time, it is imperative that we look at organizations. And for us, we've been looking very critically at civil society organizations and how they can play a role in sort of institutionalizing some of these mechanisms around privacy, around participation from the bottom up. So how that can sort of guide more institutional practices and ecosystem-led practices, as opposed to sort of relying primarily on sort of a top-down mechanism or engagement. So very keen to see sort of how these conversations progress. We've been looking at data stewardship in context of environment and sort of environmental conservation and sustainability. And that has really sort of opened us up to conversations around the harm of data, but also how it can be unlocked for value. And I think there's a lot of interesting work that is yet to be done around indigenous data sovereignty. I did see that sort of referenced by Tim Davies at the beginning of this conversation, speaks much to the sort of, well, I think the concerns around how categorization fails to consider the lived realities and experiences of many indigenous communities who have sort of quite extensive knowledge sets and assets that can help guide climate change and resilience policies. So I'll stop there, but very curious to see how this conversation evolves, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Suha, and thank you also for, as usual, weaving it up, in such a wonderful way. And also giving us, the extension of the topics that would also be worth to further look into. And with this, last but not least, I would like to introduce you to Kasia Chmieliński, who's a co-founder at the Data Nutrition Project. And Kasia, I'm very sorry to have to say that from the get-go. If you could compress your points to 2 minutes, it would be wonderful, because this way we'll make right, with the time for the others. It's the unfortunate reality of, the times. So I hope that's okay.
No problem at all. Thanks so much for having me. This is actually excellent. It means I got to have my morning coffee in New York and just listen. I don't have to say much, so the pressure's off. No, thanks so much. And I really enjoyed hearing everyone's work. It's very uplifting on this Thursday morning. The work that I do is really as a practitioner who built systems for 15 years in industry, big companies, startups, academia, and government. And now as part of the Data Nutrition Project, thinking about data set quality standards and structures that will capture a lot of the qualitative information, not just the quantitative information about data. So that's kind of something that really resonated with me, is that people are thinking about data in a holistic way, it seems, in this room, which is fantastic, this virtual room, that it's not just about, does this have PII or not? It's not just about understanding the data, but it's about using the data. And I think that, trying to think through what are the use cases for the data, what can it enable? I loved the line that Benjamin said, whoever designs the data tool has the control and the power over that data. And I think that we need to consider not just what's in the data, right? So not just the feature selection and the representation and the values themselves, but also what was the intention of the data? And as what Cassie said, are there terms of art that are included? Is it domain specific in some way? I love the example of 100 different categories across 4 data sources. I mean, that's so typical within the same domain, right? I think that's so typical. And so I love kind of getting into the holistic view of the data from the very beginning, why it was collected, all the way through to how it's used. And I think a question that I have is, if the data is terrible by some objective or subjective measure and it's never used, is it less terrible? Right. So can we think about kind of the ways in which data ends up being useful or not useful, or bad or not bad? Understanding these terms are artificially simple, and start to govern and create our structures around that. And I think I know I only have 2 minutes, so let me see if there's anything else I want to bring up. Yeah, I'm also very interested in and love that people are thinking about the tensions between responsible data principles, because you can't have everything. Right. So, for example, if you're trying to understand the quantitative versus qualitative data descriptors, you could automate or standardize and make things very quantitative, but then it might not be applicable to everything. And you lose the kind of critical nature, thoughtfulness of a more bespoke data description. Or another one that would definitely come up today is the kind of the tension between data openness and data sovereignty. And sometimes you can't have those two things, right? Often you can't. I think there's a lot of work here informed, as Suha and Tim Davies mentioned, around indigenous data sovereignty. In the space, Tahu Kukutai and Maui Hudson and Abigail Echo Hawk doing a ton of amazing work around, essentially, coming back to something Magdalena said, individual versus kind of community rights. And when do you start thinking about the rights of the community as opposed to, and maybe in conjunction with the rights of the individual? So I'll stop talking there. I'm sure it's been more than 2 minutes. I have a lot more I could say, but I just want to kind of echo what everyone else has said in terms of amazing work, and thanks so much for sharing with us.
Thank you very much, Kasia. And again, 2 minutes, but so dense and so helpful. And for those of you who are not aware of the wonderful Data Nutrition Project, really check it out, because it's really, really impressive work and comes so timely. And also, Kasia, throwing it back at you, this is also making us more optimistic, knowing that these initiatives are out there. So with this, with a slight delay, but I hope you will indulge us for a couple of minutes in addition for now a closing by our wonderful Executive Director, Lorraine Urchunkula. With this, Lorraine, please, you have the floor to put a bow on it.
Thank you so much. And I'll steal the word from Cassia and say that I hope that you all feel uplifted by this 2-hour meeting. We thought maybe that's going to be too long, but as we saw, there wasn't enough time just to go over all the different topics. We could have spent much more time talking about it. And this is what I felt every time that we met the fellows monthly. Uplifted and optimistic, because there's so many people doing good work and brilliant minds doing that. So I wanted to first thank the fellows for their amazing journey that they've agreed to go with us and be really guinea pigs of this experiment, which I could say from my point of view, it was fantastic. But also to the commentators and everyone that joined today. You see we have a lot of different outputs that have been put out in the chat, and do follow each other, because those people that are here, they'll continue to do amazing work. So the idea of us bringing all of you together is also to build a network of people that are trying to break through the silos and think about data governance in a more holistic way. And also, I'm glad to introduce you the new fellows. We'll be welcoming a second cohort of fellows in this coming year. And we'll have opportunities for partnerships and events. And we thought it would be very hard to top the quality of this year's fellows, but I think we got pretty close there. So I'm really looking forward to the work that we'll be doing together with them, and to continue engaging with the alumni as well in their different career paths. So I just wanted to thank you so much for staying here with us. It's not entirely over. We'll still have breakout groups so that you can continue talking to each other and with the different fellows as well. And Carol, I think, will explain what they each contain, so that you can, just continue the conversation, like if you were in a little cocktail, but a virtual one, and continuing a chat in smaller groups. But thank you so much again, and congratulations for the amazing work that the fellows have been doing.
Thank you, Lorraine, and thank you all who have stayed with us through this. We literally just scratched the surface of the incredible work the fellows have done during this past year. They are an outgoing cohort, but that doesn't mean they will not be involved in the activities moving forward. We really want to build community with this incredible young professionals and researchers and professors. So now we have 3 working groups. If you have the time to stay with us for some more, for a couple of minutes, for up to 30 minutes. So group 1, and we're gonna put that in the chat also. How do we better connect writings on data governance? So I think it's building from the literature review discussion and the sectors and silos conclusion. Group 2, how can we be more collaborative and global when governing the data sphere? So what does that mean, right? And how we can better collaborate and break so many silos that we see and issues. So, and what are the solutions for that, the tools for that? And group 3, what does responsibly unlocking the value for data means to you, right? And we just talked about, Cassia actually mentioned briefly the issue of various versus, right? Individual versus community, and then I added in the chat other instances of that. So 3 groups. How can we better connect the writings on data governance? How can we be more collaborative at global when governing the data sphere? And what does responsibly unlocking the value of data means to you? So yes, so that are the groups, and I think Natalia will share the groups here so you can join.
Yes, they should appear in your screen. If you have any issue joining the room, please let me know.
there is a link at the bottom of your screen with breakout rooms if it doesn't spontaneously open.